I don't know if anyone's heard of NDC, different, not the big conference. They do this after-hours event called PubConf. One of the guys that's presented a couple of times, Lemon, built this. I was like, are you ready for this? Oh, wait. No more. So now with that, we're going to talk about what is this in the context of JavaScript instead of a cool little useless site. So I hate being in front of that thing. I'm going to go over here somewhere. So what is this? JavaScript's a pretty interesting language. It's quite different to other similar looking languages like C, C#, Java, in the fact that it is object-oriented, but it's a little bit functional, and also it was put together in about 12 days, so it's got some really weird stuff going on. One of the weirdest concepts that is often misunderstood is the this keyword in JavaScript. So what I'm going to do today is hopefully give you a bit of an idea of some of the fundamentals of JavaScript and why it's different to many of the other languages, like if you're .NET devs or whatever, when you move across. So who am I? Oh no, there we go. It's really slow. So my name's Jake Ginnivan. I'm the tech lead at 7 West Media. We build the west.com.au and perthnow.com.au. So I spend most of my days writing TypeScript and in React apps and Node. If you want to hit me up, you can hit me up on Twitter. My GitHub's there. As Amy said, this is a YAO talk, so I've got my YAO hashtag on there if you want to tweet about it. Just change it to Fenders or something. But there's two main things I want to talk about today. The first one is scope, and the second one is context. Without understanding scope in JavaScript properly, you're not going to be able to understand context. So we'll start with scope, but the first thing I wanted to dive into is actually, if you understand both of these things, questions around this stuff, interviewers love. So after you've gone through and learned all of this stuff that we're going to be talking about today, you've got to nail some of your JavaScript interviews. Segue, if you are looking and you can already answer and you know all of this stuff, come talk to me after because we're looking for people. Can anyone have a crack at defining scope to start? Anyone want to have a crack at what that is?
The context of which object you're in?
Context of which object you're in, good. Anyone else? Start here.
What level you can see.
Yep, what you can see, yep. Yeah, did you put...
What language will respond when you ask for certain variable things?
Yep.
The function that you're inside.
Yep, cool. So all of these concepts are quite tightly related. The simplest way I could do it is actually up the back is closest to what I got, which is scope defines the variables that you currently have access to. So scope specifically is about visibility. What can you see where you're currently executing? There are other concepts which exist in like the broader scope context and also context rather, that ties it all together. We'll dive into scope quickly first. In JavaScript, you have the global scope. So if you're executing some script and you've got in a script tag, you're going to be in the global scope, and that's got in the browser, that's window. In Node.js, it's global. And then you can have a number of local scopes. We'll have a look at how you actually define scopes soon. But when you execute a little bit of code, so console.log a, what will happen is the JavaScript runtime will actually go console, 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 finally get to the global scope, it finds it, now it's resolved the console variable. Next, we want to resolve A. We'll go to the local scope, yay, we found it, so now the whole line can execute. Every time you hit any sort of variable in JavaScript, it's got to look up and find it. Scope is about what you can see, and then we'll dive into a few other things as how it actually accesses those values soon. What happens if foo? We try and access foo, and foo doesn't exist. We go to foo, we go through all the local scopes to the global one, hit the global scope, Can't find it in the global scope. Now you get this reference error foo is not defined. So this is the simplest way I can see at explaining scopes. So let's have a look at scopes in ES5. I'll treat ES6 separately. There we go. Okay, so to demonstrate scopes, I'm just going to build a counter. So I've got a function that is called createCounter. I then will call that function and get my counter up, and then I'll increment the counter. I'm actually using a VS Code plugin called Quokka.js. It's a great tool. It's a sort of companion to another one called Wallaby.js. If you're a .NET dev and you've used Ncrunch, Wallaby.js is like Ncrunch for JavaScript, so it's a continual test runner. And Quokka just allows you to turn a JavaScript file into an executing environment. So as I type, it'll be evaluating. And this little thing here, if you just put a comment with a question mark, it prints whatever value was before it. So in this case, it'll print what's returned from increment. So inside my counter, I want to declare a variable, which will be my count. Also, you notice the auto formatting. If you're using JavaScript and not using prettier, get on that. It's revolutionary. So I'll return a increment function. And the increment function will go count equals count plus 1. If I've done this right, which I haven't, because I have to return count, you'll see that I've created a scope here. Inside the scope, I have a variable, which is called count. If I try and access count outside, I get count as not defined. So a scope not only controls what you have access to, but it also hides when things aren't allowed to access stuff. I then return an object, which has a single property on it, which is increment. And that is the simplest form of scopes in JavaScript. JavaScript, before ES6, was function scopes. So the only way you could create some sort of protection around variables is scoping. There is no private keywords and that sort of stuff. Make sense? If there's any questions as we go along, just throw up your hand. I'll answer them as we go. I'm going to get rid of this because otherwise it's just going to be in the way. Cool. So that was a quick introduction to scopes. So a quick summary. In ES5, we use functions to create scopes, and the variables you can reference is controlled by the scopes that you currently have access to. If you nest functions within each other, you can access parent functions, variables, etc. This is actually called something called lexical scoping. So if you want to actually learn about the rules around scoping, it's called lexical scoping. C#, C, a number of other languages use lexical scoping. The other one, if you're wondering why this is a particular type, is called dynamic scoping, and it works differently, and I won't go into that today. So this is the function we saw. When we execute createCounter, it creates this scope here. Inside that scope, you've got arguments, which there are none. You've got the variable count of 0. You've got the inner function, which is increment. I've actually mistyped that, sorry about that. And you can also access the createCounter function, which is itself. So that's the scope. So then when I call increment, it actually is executing the inner function. And the scope around that can access everything inside that function, but also everything in the outer function. So I can also access createCounter, I can access increment, and I can also access counter if it wasn't redefined there. So that's lexical scoping in a nutshell. It's the execution is tied to the declaration. So this is inside this, so it can see everything in the outer function. Make sense? Questions? Sweet. I also, another thing is I'm trying to condense most of the information here down into about 25 minutes. Yao's 40, so I'm moving a little bit quicker than I normally would. So a bit of a summary. If you throw these out in your interview, you'll do quite well. So JavaScript is a lexically scoped language, which before ES6 used functions to create scopes. So that's true, we've learnt that. And then when executing your code, you can reference variables declared in your local scope, local scopes which wrap your code, and the global scope. So they're two kind of sentences you can throw out, but there's plenty of others you could explain for yourself. So if scopes define the visibility of a variable, how does JavaScript access the current value? Because that one function might be executed multiple times with different values. JavaScript actually has a different way of accessing those variables that you're allowed to see. And this is actually called something called closures. So when someone says that you're going to close over a variable, it means you're going to be creating a closure to a variable that you have in scope. Is this starting to put some terms, hopefully loosely, into place? So we'll quickly dive over to VS Code again and look at closures. So I've got my same create counter here with my increment function. I've also just added this debugger statement. VS Code is really handy. You can just say F5 on a JavaScript file and say run with Node.js, and it will just run it and step into the debugger. So you can actually see here I've got my local, which has my global on it. It has this increment function. That's my child function, or a function declared within the code that's currently executing. And it's got this scopes, magic scopes variable on it. If I extend that, you can actually see two things. You can see that I've got the first item in the array is a closure, and the closure is test. So because I've accessed, within this function, I've accessed this variable, JavaScript has automatically created a closure that captures that variable for me. If I only reference variables within my current function, there would only be one item in that scopes, which would be global, which is everything. So as you get further nested down, JavaScript will attach more and more of these scopes every time you access variables outside of your current scope. Still, if there's any questions, just yell, remember, it's all good. If I set a variable, a breakpoint inside this one here, which I can't see because of Quokka, I'll just use that. You can actually see that VS Code will show us our closure as well when we're inside the function. DevTools are great. They give us visibility of stuff we normally can't see. So that's closures. Any questions? Cool. Summary and closures. When JavaScript functions access a variable in any local scope other than their own, JavaScript runtime will automatically create a closure and attach it to that function's execution context. We can't cover execution context right now. That's in the second part of the talk, so just leave that there, and hopefully when we cover context, scopes and closures and stuff, it'll all come together and JavaScript will make a lot more sense for you. Something that happened a little while ago now is the introduction of ECMAScript 6. So JavaScript had about 11 years of being stagnant of ES5, and they were working on ES6 for ages. It was a new version of the language that aimed to solve a number of maintainability problems that ES5 had. One of them was scoping and closures to make it easier for us to deal with. So when you're dealing with ES6, generally it's a much better experience than it would be using ES5. We'll quickly have a look at what that means for us. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Cool. So back in VS Code, we're going to look at a concept that got introduced called block scoping. So if we're coming from C# or Java or C, we're used to working within a block scoped language. JavaScript is function scoped before ES6. So we've got this little example here. I've got a for loop with a set timeout. So after 500 milliseconds or half a second, it will print console log with the value of I. Now, what happens, and this is a typical bug that pops up in JavaScript code, is it prints 5 times. Because this file is our scope. We have no functions here to create a new scope, right? So what happens is it goes through and loops really, really fast, sets all these timeouts. In half a second, it calls all of them back. But because there's no closure to capture what the value of I was at the time of execution, they all print the value that the loop ended with. Does that make sense? So the way we get around that is something called an inline invocable function expression, or IFE. And you would have probably seen this and gone, what the hell does that mean? It just means we're going to create a function here that immediately invokes itself. I have to wrap it in braces as well, because if I don't wrap it in brackets, it's a function that doesn't have a name, not a function expression. JavaScript is dumb. But essentially, I create an anonymous function that wraps my code. Now you see, that didn't fix it, because I is still declared outside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say my function takes one argument, which is I, and then I'm going to pass the value of I to my IFE. So inside my loop, I've created a function which I immediately call, passing the current value of I, which ends up as this argument for each iteration. Make sense? Everyone following? This is dumb. No one, this is just silly. So what we do in ES6 is we'll go back to our original code and we'll change this to a let, which is instead a block scoped variable. And suddenly it's fixed. You can see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. A block in JavaScript is just a set of braces. So because the loop declares the variable I as a block scoped variable in the loop, it means each iteration of that loop gets its own version of I. I go back to var, which is function or module scoped, and we go back to function scoping, and it's dumb, right? Block scoping is amazing. So now you understand when people are like, oh my God, let and const, they make JavaScript so much better. This is why. So the moral of the story, use let everywhere or const. The only difference between those two is a let, you can keep setting the value. So if I try and go const, you'll see that it says assignment to constant variable because each one's trying to set the value and you're only allowed to set the value of a constant once. That's the only difference between let and const. So ES6 makes closures and scoping way better. There's a couple of other features when we dive into context, which also help. So let and const, all the things. Block scope it because it'll make your code easier to understand and you don't have to understand silly function scoping rules. Yo.
Matt, just going back to your code example, are you defining block as the curly braces? Because in that example, you declared in the variable in the for, like the instantiation
Yeah.
of the for loop.
Yeah, I was wondering if someone would pick me up on that. So it's just the behavior of the language. They've kind of, because it's a for loop, they've defined that the spec for the for loop are block scopes for each iteration. So it's just like a behavioral, because a for loop, what the code inside there is kind of special, and it's an extension of the language. They can define how the let works. Yo.
Does it follow that same scope stack where like it didn't find it in the initial block, so then it goes out to the other block?
Possible. Yeah, probably. So a for loop probably declares its own block, essentially. So it's not just inside the for loop. I'll look into that so I can answer that better. That's not a very good answer, but essentially everything declared inside the for loop is part of that block. Cool. Any other questions? Nice. So that's scope. That's kind of the first half of the equation. The second one is this. Let's have a little bit of a pop quiz. Now, the idea of this is, this pop quiz, oh, that word's so overloaded, is it's fine to get the answer wrong. JavaScript is silly. Most of the stuff you won't have to use on a day-to-day basis, but when you do hit problems around this, hopefully it'll make your life debugging these things a little bit easier. So what's the value? We're looking for the value that's returned from each of these variables. So I've got declare name up here. I call the say name function, and then it executes. What's the value of, let's say, the second one first? Cool. That one's pretty easy. What about the first one? Yes. First one is undefined because the variable is declared within this function, but the value isn't assigned yet. So because the variable is declared within the function, it won't go out to a parent scope because that variable does exist in my scope. Cool. What happens if I change it to a let? Anyone? No. Name is not defined. So we'll dive into, just after these examples, why this is a thing. But ES6 introduced a new problem called the temporal dead zone. And yeah, JavaScript and naming. But it's essentially the problem that I'm referencing a variable that has not been declared yet. Previously in JavaScript, there was this concept called hoisting. That's not actually what happens. We'll dive into what it actually is doing. But with ES6, the block scoping also removes the hoisting behavior. So you can't reference a variable that is declared within that scope if it hasn't been initialized yet. So more sensible, less weird problems that you're like, why is this undefined? Oh. What about this one? Arguments. No, it's an array with Jake in it because it's a magic variable that exists in the scope, and it is all of the function arguments that are passed to your function. So if you want to have a function that can take any number of arguments and then iterate over it, you can use this magic arguments keyword. So they're just some examples of how JavaScript's a little bit weird, but what actually happens when you call a function in JavaScript? So I've got this same thing, say hi. I need to fix this because I've kind of busted it. I'm supposed to pass Jake in there, but bear with me. So I call say name, passing Jake, that you just have to imagine, and then it's also say hi, so I need to rename that too. But I now am executing this function. Here will be undefined because it's a var, and then I've also got an inner function just for the hell of it. So what happens when I execute say name is JavaScript will create something called an activation object. The activation object will have a variable object, which is just like a bucket of all the variables within the scope of that function. So on it will be name, which I passed in. It'll also have greeting, which is currently undefined because it was done in here. It'll also have the inner function that I've declared. So whenever you use a variable reference, it will go to this activation object, look for the variable object that has that value, and then use it. Cool. It also has the scopes that we saw earlier, and that will contain any closures of variables that you've closed over in your function. Yeah. So when we execute in here, greeting equals hi, this is now the execution context of that function, and while that function is executing, it will live the whole time that that function is executing. And then it'll just update the variable to hi. Cool? Kind of making sense? Sweet. What about this? Some more pop quizzes. This one's fun. So what is this in this context? So many thises. Sorry? Yes, window. It's if you're in the browser, it's window. If you're in Node, it's the global variable. We'll dive into why that is. What about here? I've got a greeter, and I'm calling the greet function on it, and it's returning this.name. Yep. Hi, yow. Excellent. What about if I pull that function out and declare it outside of this object, and then I just put that function onto this object? Yow again. So functions in JavaScript are actually first-class objects. You can pass them around, and you can assign, like you can just put a function on another object, and you don't change the function at all. Like the function is the function. Whatever you've written it in, you can say function.toString, and it will give you the code in that function. They are essentially immutable. What changes is the way we call the function. So here I'm calling greeter.greet. Because greeter is before it, this object gets assigned to this. So the default implementation is whatever's preceding that dot is assigned to this. Cool. So given that, what about this one? I've got my greeter here, and then I've got a button, and I assign greeter.greet to onClick. What do you think happens? Yep, hi undefined, because button doesn't have a name on it. What about this? This is a special function, on function, called call. Has anyone had to use this? Yeah. So what call does, and apply as well, is the first argument to call. Actually, I've messed up this example looking at it now, but I'll explain why. When you call and pass it a value, it will give you back a new function. No, that's bind. Anyway, so when you use call and pass it the first value, that will be assigned to this. So you can override what the value of this is. Because I've got this function greet, and it's going this.name, I can go call greeter, and inside this function, that greeter variable will become this. So it's hi yow. I started tripping up with bind. So bind allows you, does anyone know what bind does? Cool. So bind allows you to essentially set the value of this, and it returns a new function that has this bound. What happens if I bind and then call it? Anyone want to guess? Yeah, the bind override. So even though I use call, if someone's bound that function earlier, it doesn't matter what I do, they've set the context for that call. So it's a little bit confusing. We'll quickly jump over to VS Code, and we'll see our example. So you might be wondering why actually introduce this? Like, what's the value of all of the complexity and confusion? If you look at this create counter, our example before, if I create 2 counters, it executes here, and then it creates a function in the scope of counter, which means every time I create a counter, I have to create an increment function. So it's not really much memory usage in this example, but if you got into a massive application and you were doing this everywhere and you had thousands of objects, that's a lot of extra functions to create. So the value of this is we can take this increment function, move it outside of our thing, our other function. We can then go this dot counter, and I can return, I've got increment there. Cool. So I can return an object that has counter and increment on it. When I run that, you'll see that I've now shared the same function, declared it once, and shared it amongst multiple objects. So that's really the whole reason that this keyword exists, is purely memory usage and not creating functions over and over, and then having to use closures to access them and all of those associated overheads. It allowed the JavaScript runtime to just be faster. But as I said, the main thing here is that the counter is the context of this is whatever's before it. There's a few other variations of what this code I could write, but don't have too much time. Any questions about this? Cool. So in summary, this is basically the variable before the dot will be assigned to this for that current function scope. Unless that function has been bound using the bind keyword, which returns us a new function, or is invoked with call or apply, and the first argument is passed. Sweet. So that is scope and context. They're all quite tied together. We've got scope that controls the visibility. When you access something within your, that you can see, JavaScript will create a closure. And you have the context and the this keyword to make sure that you don't always have to create new closures, because every time you create a closure, it's more memory usage, and so they're all kind of related. So that's been what is this. Does anyone have any questions? Got a couple of minutes.
Was your second or third example, you had a var in the global scope?
Yep.
And then you accessed it inside the function and you were saying it was undefined.
Yep. So inside here, might have been earlier. Yeah. So if I declare, let's go. So if I declare a variable test inside this function, you'll see that I now, I can't access the variable outside of the scope because I've redeclared it in my scope. Does that answer the question, or was there?
Oh, so it was the internal var.
Internal var. So as soon as you've used the var keyword for that variable inside your current scope, it doesn't matter that it exists outside or that it was declared later in the function. It was declared inside that function. So because I have var test, I can never access the value of the test outside of my function.
Now, if you delete that, the one inside,
That one.
in your example, we might be talking about a different example. In your example, you had a var test,
Mm-hmm.
and then the first line you just had test, or something like that.
Oh, yep.
And
So,
you were saying that would be undefined. I was like, why can't it just read from the outer scope?
yeah, so I think it might have been
Greeting. One of those.
that one.
No,
Yeah.
yeah. What
That
is
one.
that?
This one.
What is the first name?
Yep.
Oh, it's because of the latter name.
Yep, because there is var name later in the function,
Yep.
it's not assigned yet. Cool.
You said that isn't specifically due to hoisting. Why is that?
Yeah, so I probably should have called it out, but here, hoisting is the behavior. So because I have when I execute the function, the JavaScript runtime will parse that function and create the activation object. When I hit that first line, it'll be looking in the activation object for the value, which hasn't been assigned yet. So it's hoisted in theory, like the behavior would be the same as if I moved this var greeting up the top and then here had greeting equals hi. In essence, it's exactly the same, but the JavaScript runtime doesn't move all of the variable declarations to the top. It just finds them all and creates the activation object. So it has the same effect of hoisting, but it's just, it kind of uses this instead. Okay.
In the button example, I'm not quite sure why that was undefined.
Yep, cool. So the button example here is the same as inside this. If I went var local increment equals counter 1 dot increment, and then print out local increment. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, wait. There we go. Because I've basically grabbed that function, which is referencing this, and taken it away, not called it through the object, it has no this, so this will become the global scope, and it won't work anymore. So the way I get around that is by going bind counter 1. Now that'll work because I've set what this will be, and then I can pass that around safely, and it will be associated with the correct object and context. Cool, better leave it there and let your other speakers. Thanks.